Today, in episode number 6 of the Mark Joyner Show, cult survivor warns, you are being brainwashed. Dave, how are you, man?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time because I think we're going to cover some really good ground here that everybody needs to hear.
I think it's going to be really exciting, and it's one of those things that you and I have been talking about doing for ever. And
Forever.
There's the danger that this could go in crazy places and take forever. So I'm excited.
Well, yeah, I mean, so let's dive right into it. But first, I want to give everybody a little bit of context and background here. I want the audience to understand at the end of this, you should be equipped with some knowledge that most people do not have. More and more people are becoming aware of what's going on in this respect. However, I would say that the vast majority of the world is still largely unaware of these phenomena, and they need to be aware of these phenomena. And we are going to deal in things that you can prove for yourself. So Dave and I both have, some intelligence community background. Dave has a cult background. We'll get into that briefly here in a second. We've both written books on persuasion. I can't come up here and say, well, I was in the intelligence community and I can tell you some unverifiable thing that I saw. That doesn't help you, right? But what I can tell you is here's something that you can verify for yourself. Here's something that you can see for yourself. And we're going to try to stay in that realm so that this doesn't go, too far outside of that. So with that said, Dave, can you tell us your background in, you grew from 6 to 16, I think. You were in a cult, yeah?
Yeah, I was in a cult from the time I was 6 until I was 16. They were a very strict Protestant cult. They believed in an end-time prophet named William Branham. They believed he was the literal resurrection of the prophet Elijah from the Bible. They believed in no education past 6th or 7th grade, that women had to be subservient to their husbands or corporal punishment was allowed. No cutting your hair if you were a woman, no wearing any garment that pertained to a man, no facial hair if you were a man, and short hair only. That's probably the only thing that I've maintained is the short hair piece. But it was really a very, very strict religious cult. No marrying outside the organization. We lived in a very small town, a small group of people, went to church on Tuesdays, Thursdays, twice on Sundays. And it was a very, very strict sort of arrangement. And this, and the interesting thing was the prophet that they believed in died in 1965, the same year I was born. But they continued to believe that he was the literal resurrection of the prophet Elijah from the Bible. So he would be coming back, and he was the forebearer of the book of Revelations. And so the end times, the apocalypse.
I want to ask you a really interesting question before we start talking about how people are being brainwashed today. And it's quite relevant to the topic of cults. How can people distinguish between cults and just ordinary groupings of people? And I know that there is no really, really hard and fast line, but I would love to hear your distinction.
Well, I think it starts usually with some charismatic leader, somebody who is demanding of people some obedience, allegiance, some kowtowing, some ordainment, wherever that ordainment comes from, whatever your beliefs are, whether you believe it comes from God or some other source. They believe that there's some ordainment and that person is special. And so that specialness, whatever it is, gives them authority over the rest of people. And by the way, that doesn't just happen inside of religions. Like you mentioned, it could happen in any sort of groups. I mean, if you look at things, everything from, if you looked at somebody like, Werner, who started EST, or you looked at, you look at even in Buddhism, or you look at something like martial arts, there's lots of gurus and people like that. And particularly where it shows up is the personal development movement. So there's many people there who have done very negative things that people follow and believe in, and it's only beneficial to them. When I talk about persuasion, one of the things I talk about is the difference between persuasion and manipulation. And persuasion and manipulation, the difference that I see is really intent. When I was interviewing people about persuasion. I talked to attorneys, and attorneys were one of the people who's really interesting. They, the traditional definition of persuasion is any attempt to influence somebody's position or opinion is persuasion. It's also manipulation. So, and attorneys see no difference. And so, as I thought about that, I started thinking about what is the really difference, and it comes down to intent. So whatever people's intent is, these same tools that we'll talk about work for good or evil.
Mm. I want to make a couple of interesting distinctions on top of that. This is great stuff. By the way, we got Marshall Silver in here, another really, really great professional persuader hanging out in the audience. Great dude. And
Marshall's incredible.
Yeah, he's great. Yeah, good friend. And just a consummate artist at what he does,
100%.
So two distinctions here. One, I would like to point out, and I want to know if you agree or disagree with either of these points. So one is, I think that we are all persuading each other all the time, right? In fact, I would go so far as to say that we can't not persuade each other just by showing up in some degree. Another distinction that I would like to make is, in addition to intent, which I think is enormously important, but also extremely difficult to discern, right? How do we know what someone's intent is? It can be, right? Well, yeah, and there are tools. There are subtler tools that most people are not aware of. I was dealing with somebody that I'm kind of fits the classic definition of narcissistic personality disorder recently. Who's in the personal development community, and I saw a very clear instance there of another one of the boundaries that I've been able to distinguish, which is, if you ask someone to respect a boundary, right? Most people are like, hey, that's your boundary. I respect it. That's cool. I'm backing off. You don't need to say anything else.
Right.
Some of these guys who are kind of like culty people will be like, your boundary's wrong. Why do you have that boundary? And this is sort of like gaslighting, right? I mean, this is
100%.
Right? Yeah. This is another one of these distinctions that I think will help people discern, like, hey, what's the difference between a healthy group of people? Because we all form groups, hopefully, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah.
By necessity.
So by necessity. So what do you think about the notion that it's impossible for us not to persuade each other? Do you agree or disagree with that?
Oh, no, I think if you want to talk about a species-ending event, stop persuading each other.
Nice. I heard somebody say recently, well, not too recently, actually, they said, that the difference between persuasion and coercion is incredibly important. We should be in a world where we can all persuade each other, right? Because when we stop that, we start coercing, and that's
Yeah, and I think we are persuading each other all the time, whether it's just simply, whether as marketers we're trying to get people to like our brand better, whether it's as a human being trying to get, someone of the opposite sex or the same sex or whatever your preference is to like you more. For that purpose, we're trying to persuade people to see things our way. The difference is, though, is when we can't agree to disagree on things. Yes. And still be friends and still be connected and all of those things. Like if you and I dug into it deep enough, and we probably wouldn't even have to dig that far, we'd find many things that we don't see eye to eye about, or we don't see in the same way.
For sure.
And we could still be great friends.
This is one of the things that you and I have spoken about a lot, and it's been one of the drum beats that I have been attempting to hammer over and over again throughout the years, especially in social media. Well, and also in just about every way I show up in all the books that I write as well. Most of my books are kind of advocacy, disguised as self-help and disguised as business books.
For sure.
But one thing that I'm always wanting people to understand is, it's like, look, the ability to agree or to disagree rather, and still remain friends is, I would say, critically important for us as a species. And, I run across people, I throw these, true or false questions, or people say, oh, it's a divisive question. You're trying to create division. It's like, no, I'm actually trying to create a space where we can all discuss these things. And if you show up in a divisive way, that's your problem. And hopefully you can kind of figure out that, I see this other person over there, they disagree with me, but I see them as a human being. Like, holy crap, I would love to elevate the fact that we all disagree on certain things and make it normal and make it okay. We are in a climate right now where it's not okay to disagree.
Yeah, you can disagree without being disagreeable. You can disagree without being coercive. You can disagree without being mean. But there's not room for that right now. in a lot of people's minds that any version of disagreement means you're on the other side of me. One of the things I talk about a lot in persuasion is that only polarized people buy things. And that is true. And unfortunately, it's never been truer or more obvious today. That we've pushed people to such extreme levels of polarization that they really can't see any other way out other than verbal violence, other than physical violence, other than, these clashing of people and disagreeing in such monstrous ways that they can't find another way out. And that's really unfortunate because the polarization is important for the conversation, but it's not good when it goes too far.
Yeah. Marshall has a really good comment here. He says, high self-esteem allows for differences in others. I don't need to agree with you to still respect you. Good words, Dave. Right on, and, we see a lot of really interesting manifestations of this, I think, truly bizarre and caustic phenomenon in the world right now. And you'll see people posting stuff on social media like, if you agree with politician X, unfriend me now, or, yeah, I mean, I think that's just so infantile. And, the fact that people can do that and then actually applaud each other like, oh, bravo for taking such a brave stance. No, not bravo for that.
But let's be honest. That's really an attempt to say, please love me.
Yeah, right. It's a call for help, actually.
It's a call for help. It's a call for saying, please love me. Please say that you agree with me and that you like me. And many of these people actually don't fully understand the opinion that they purport to hold. And that's one of the challenges with polarization. Polarization happens most easily with easy to understand and digest messages that you can take and that you can shout from the rooftops and repeat at the water cooler, and that you can get morally indignant and enraged about, versus actually understanding the argument.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, in fact, if you are arguing about these things in an emotionally heated way, we know matter-of-factly that it actually downgrades your ability to function intellectually. And this is why.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. It's unequivocal at this point. There's such a tremendous body of evidence to support that. And this is why athletes will often try to crawl up in the heads of other athletes, because it is a game-changing thing. Michael Jordan, for example, was one of the nastiest trash talkers. Rumor has it, right? I wasn't there. I didn't get to be on the receiving end of that. I wouldn't even play basketball. But a lot of fighters. I'm into MMA and all that. A lot of fighters, like Conor McGregor, he would crawl up into the head of his opponent well before the event and have that guy going in all sucked up into his ego and all emotionally invested, so that Conor could come in all cool and collect. Whatever you think of Conor, the techniques that he used were outstanding. Now, this is a really good segue into the mass brainwashing of the world, the primary topic that's going on today. And I want to start out with a really interesting question for you. What percentage of the corporate news, and I'm talking about all of the corporate news, left and right, whatever you want to call it, okay, all across the full political spectrum, what percentage of the corporate news would you say is real journalism, and what percentage is, let's just call it brainwashing? Persuasion, whatever we want to call it.
Sure. So I think we have to have some definition of what real journalism is. So let's see if we can agree on a definition first. So I think that if we say, because somebody's going to argue with us and say, it's journalism if they're printing it, it's journalism if they're putting it out in a certified media, that kind of thing. But let's just say that that an agreed upon definition of journalism might be investigative reporting that allows people to present factual information that demonstrates both sides of an argument and presents evidence for people to look at and judge on their own.
I think that's a very good definition. I want to bring in a little bit of context here that I think would be very useful for us. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a website. It's the Society of Professional Journalists has something called the Code of Journalistic Ethics. And I want to just read a couple of these things there. I don't want to read the whole thing because it will, get a little belabored here.
Yeah.
But what I'll do is I'll share this particular page with everybody here. All right. So you guys should be able to see that here in a moment. And we'll see if we can zoom this in a little bit. Okay, so journalists should take responsibility for the accuracy of their work, verify information before releasing it, use original sources whenever possible. Do you see that happening very often in today's journalism, Dave?
I see an attempt at verifying accuracy of work, but the requirement and the necessity for pressing out news so fast means that it doesn't happen on a very regular basis. That it's most often fact checked after the fact. But the problem with that is, as you know, it's the first piece that counts, right? So the moment that you put this out and a million people have read it, it's too late to fact check it and change it then.
Perfectly timed, because the second point is, remember that neither speed nor format excuses inaccuracy.
Okay. Nice sentiment. Probably 100% not applying.
Yeah, certainly not being applied, right?
Yeah.
So next one, provide context. Take special care not to misrepresent or oversimplify in promoting, previewing, or summarizing a story.
Again, not being applied appropriately, because let's be really honest, the point of the news is to sell a story, and the point of selling a story is to sell the news. And
That's right.
It's not going, this happens because they're trying to get you to think something without necessarily misrepresenting it. So it's clickbait.
Yeah. So I would just ask everybody to go to, it's spj.org is the website. You guys can read the code. I mean, this is a thing that exists, this code of journalistic ethics. We've got a former, an active journalist still here. Allison Hill is one of the people commenting and watching. She is a very accomplished journalist, and she is also very unhappy with the current state of journalism as well. Yeah. She would probably, I'm not going to speak for her, but I would imagine from my conversations with her that she would agree that this code is not really being followed. And the code
it's a good idea.
Yeah.
If people did follow it, we would have better news. If people, if they did try and do these things, we would have more accurate reporting. But I think as it is, I mean, there's a part of me that hopes, I guess, that the majority of journalists are not malicious. But I do think that they're easily influenced, manipulated, and coerced into creating packets of news that best serve the agenda of the publication.
Yeah. Well, there are probably some areas where you and I might disagree, right? So, and we'll still remain friends. How about that? So, I believe that the corruption of the media is a lot deeper than just financial interests. Okay, and I'll explain.
I agree 100%.
You agree? Okay. So a lot of people say, hey, it's just, they just want to drive ads. And I'm thinking, that doesn't explain the fact that a majority of outlets will repeat the same inaccurate information over, like that doesn't drive clicks. That to me connotes that there is something going on. If I were still in the intelligence community, I think analysts that I would talk to would say that is evidence, that there is some coordination going on there, right? So, for example,
I would say, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the horse dewormer smear of ivermectin that Joe Rogan so wonderfully exposed when he had the Sanjay Gupta, CNN's doctor on. He did a beautiful job of making
destroyed his argument completely.
And I mean, the CNN and all these other outlets that were doing this were clearly disingenuous, and and after the fact they still doubled down on it and said it's okay because, well, it is used as horse dewormer. They weren't recognizing that they were, like, you could have said the same thing about aspirin. Dave Lakhani, uses horse or dog medicine for headache, right?
Yeah.
And it's aspirin. Well, that's clearly framing information in an inaccurate way.
I think Joe Rogan did it perfectly when he put out the meme that said Joe Rogan drank 40 ounces of water. CNN reports Joe Rogan drinks engine coolant as a daily supplement.
yeah, right. Beautiful. I didn't see that meme, but that's a spectacular one. So, I mean, I would say, and another thing I want to point out is that a lot of people are like, well, Mark, if you believe in some grand conspiracy, how could, 3 people can't keep a secret, blah, blah, blah. There are 2 things that they don't understand, right? They don't understand compartmentalization, and they don't understand basic tradecraft. So
Right.
in the US military, in the intelligence community, we have compartments of information, right? That's one way that we keep secrets. Not everybody has to be in on a big secret. You just have your compartment, and you have usually a very, very narrow view of a larger picture of what's going on. The other thing is that somebody doesn't have to be in on something. They can be coerced. And a basic way of controlling an intelligence asset in the human intelligence world, the human world, is, you can get compromising materials on them. The Russians call it kompromat, right? That you can use to like say, hey, we've got a video of you doing something naughty. You don't want this out. We're going to, coerce you into doing what we want you to do. Bribery, obviously, using people's vices, and even so far as threatening people's families. And everybody's got, a button that can be pushed. So not all of these people have to be in on some larger conspiracy for a larger conspiracy to exist.
Right. Well, I think the other piece of that is too, now we also have to add social media to this, where everyone is vying for a click. And so even people who are not journalists, who have an agenda and who have some desire to be like wanted, to be desirable, grab hold of information that is presented and try and spread it as fast as they can so they can be the first one to get people to click. So then you have hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people sharing inaccurate information very, very quickly. And then there's no retraction that ever catches up with that. And right. I think the other piece of it is exactly what you said. And this is one of the things that I think, Mark, you and I probably would agree on, and that no one is really talking about that much here, is that a lot of what is happening in the United States particularly, but I would say also Europe and most of the Western countries right now, is one of the biggest propaganda wars we've ever seen leveraged or levered against Western democracy.
No doubt.
And it's, it's coming from, everybody knows where it's coming from. I mean, if you say Russia, China, Iran, that's the beginning of it. North Korea, you can go on and on. Yeah. Of the countries that are doing it, but it's being fueled because the tools are available now that were never available when we were in the Army. For example, the tools were never available that are available today to be able to disseminate information at the speed or the breadth that we can in a minute.
That's unequivocal, right? I mean, the speed of the transfer of information is far faster now than it's ever been, and it's only getting faster. And a really interesting statistic that I like to bring up, and this is, a larger, topic, just kind of a side topic where I talk about the complexity gap. It's this gap in between how much information we can process in conscious working memory and the amount of information available in the stream. Now, in 2004, Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, famously said that by the end of 2003, if we take all of the data that has been amassed from the dawn of recorded history until the end of 2003, it was about 5 exabytes. And in 2004, we reached a point where we were entering 5 exabytes of data into the stream every single day. And the rate at which we are entering data into the stream is also increasing exponentially. So this is an unprecedented time, and it makes it very difficult to discern what's going on. So it's sort of the best possible environment to manipulate information to control people. Now, you said that there's clearly a campaign going on against the West. I would like to know, like, what you think. Let's go straight to the jugular on that. What do you think the intent of that campaign is? What do you think the nature of it is?
I think it's ultimately to weaken the resolve of the people, to turn them against each other, to turn them against their governments, to get them it's to undermine the stability and strength of those countries. And listen, let's be really, really honest. It's not something that we haven't done ourselves as a country in many, many countries also. So all you have to do is look back 100%. Through history, and see how it's worked, see what was done, and then look at what's happening now. And you can make the connections for yourself. It's very clear and obvious. Look at Venezuela, look at Pakistan, look at most of South America generally. You can look at all of those countries and the places that we had our handprints, and you can see exactly what's happening to us now, except we didn't have those tools then, but we do now.
I want to bring up a specific historical case study on that note to just underscore for people how real this is, something that, again, we spoke about verifiability at the beginning here. One of my favorite examples, which is very, very easy to verify, Freedom of Information Act, thankfully, made this very clear. Operation Ajax in the 1950s. A lot of people don't know that, the not too distant history of Iran, they had a democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh. He wanted to nationalize the oil industry, which was controlled by British Petroleum. Great Britain came to the United States and said, hey, let's take Iran to war. And then we said, no, we don't need to do that. Let's use the CIA. They send in Kermit Roosevelt, a grandson of FDR. And he was one of the CIA officers at the time. And he started this operation where he bribed journalists to say Mossadegh is a socialist. They paid people, everyday people, to create fake, anti-socialism, anti-Mossadegh protests on the street. And these journalists these bribed journalists reported on fake protests and created the impression that everybody was against Mossadegh. That impression became the reality. It became the belief system of the people of Iran. And that allowed us to install the Shah of Iran. Go ahead a little bit. We look at we know this phenomenon called blowback. When we do stuff like this, there are consequences. We call that blowback. The blowback was the Islamic Revolution. So we wouldn't have a theocracy in Iran, arguably, if we hadn't done that. But the really important thing here to remember is we did all that. And
Right.
So when we know that happened, are we to look at our own news and say, oh, that's all wholesome and real, and it's just real journalists telling stories? Or is somebody manipulating the story for a purpose?
And you can say, oh, Dave and Mark are about to go down the conspiracy rabbit hole, but the reality of it is that if you look at a lot of the outlets that have facilitated that, they've admitted that in fact, they were perpetrated on and helped perpetrate some of these messages by not being careful with how they vetted news or vetted information or allowed people to present information on their platform. So they've admitted complicity, even though they're saying it's not our fault, but we were complicit.
100%. Yeah. I mean, if you look at Project Veritas, they've done a very good job of exposing the complicity of social media and corporate media in amplifying certain messages and then throttling down other messages. It's unequivocal. It's clear to you and me, but there are a lot of people out there who still operate under the assumption that, that just doesn't happen, and journalism is all legit.
Or let's take it away from politics for a minute. Let's look at something like breakfast, for example.
Perfect. I know exactly where you're going. Yeah.
Edward Bernays, right? So, a healthy bacon and eggs breakfast, right? So Edward Bernays was he was a paid lobbyist for the pork industry and also for the poultry industry. And so he went and asked doctors a very simple question, which we all now hear as something different. But his question was, is it better to eat a bacon and egg breakfast than eat nothing at all? And 9 out of 10 doctors agree that a bacon and egg breakfast is the best thing anyone can eat.
Yes.
It's a very simple, slight reframe of an answer to a question, but now you can say 9 out of 10 out of 10 doctors agree with this thing because of the way the question was asked, but not the way the information was reported.
Yes. Well,
Allison Hill was just saying she's reading about the Ash experiment and the Milgram experiment.
Yeah.
I think that you're seeing the Milgram experiment play out in a massive way right now.
I love it. So let's please make that clear. So what do you mean by that? I know exactly what you mean, but I would love to hear it articulated.
Right. So the Milgram experiment was, if you're not familiar with it, and there's some really great documentaries on Netflix and Amazon Prime and that kind of thing right now about this, like the Stanford prison experiment, for example. And so if you look that up, the Stanford prison experiment, the Milgram experiment are the same thing. And so the Milgram experiment was simply this: if you gave people the trappings of authority, how would they act when they were given the ability to control an outcome for someone else. So they were asked by people in white lab coats, will you come in and will you participate in helping us do an experiment? So they would have them, then they would have someone, an actor sitting on the other side of the glass, if you will, and they would say, okay, if this person gets an answer wrong, shock them. If they continue to get it wrong, continue to increase the voltage and shock them more. And so they were asked a series of questions. The actors would intentionally get it wrong. They were not being actually electrocuted. But the people who were given the authority to do it and told that this is what they had to do, even if they questioned the authority, they would look at the person in the lab coat and they would say, I don't know if this is right, because now I'm turning this up to a point where it's dangerous. Like somebody might be really harmed or killed even. And they would just say, continue. That's all they would say, continue, and shake their head. And ultimately, these people, a big majority of them, increased the level of shock to a point where people could be harmed or killed. And it was simply because someone in a perceived position of authority told them to do it, and because they had agreed in the beginning that they would take part in this experiment. And so the Milgram experiment demonstrates that people respond to authority very easily, and that perceived authority and the perceived message from the authority allows them to take tremendous action. So, and again, I don't want to turn this into a political debate or a political argument, but if you look at why people were saying that Donald Trump was responsible for the the insurrection at the Capitol, for example, a lot of people pointed back to the Milgram experiment. All he had to do was intimate that it was okay. And that was enough to get some people to take some action, right or wrong. Yeah. And but this is happening on a daily basis, from the president to your elected officials to leaders around the world. So when you've got someone with great authority telling you something like, you have to do this thing, put something in your body, do whatever it is, it doesn't matter if there's evidence to the contrary. As long as someone with superior authority is saying continue, people do it anyway, and they continue to do it because authority was easy.
Yeah, and I want to make really clear to people, you brought up one particular example that has a political flavor to it.
Yeah,
so we need to all be aware that this is being used across the political spectrum.
Right
now, whether it was Trump's intention, to do that or not, and that's a whole conversation we could have, and whether it was the media's intention to stoke it, or it's so complex. But of course, most of us, when we talk about it, we hunker down in our political side, and then we throw rocks at the other side, and we don't really engage in a reasonable conversation. I want to take a quick side note on this, and I want to demonstrate bad persuasion. I'm going to do something that most people would consider to be a rapport-breaking thing. But Dave and I have got a good friendship going for 20 years, so I know that we can stand it. I want to make a minor correction on something Dave said. And if I am wrong, please, Claire, please let me know. But I believe that the Stanford prison experiment is a slightly different thing. I thought that was the one by Philip Zimbardo, where he had the people dress up as prison guards and act as prisoners.
Yeah, you're right. You're exactly right. It was based off of the similar research, but yes, they're two separate experiments.
But you're 100% right that they demonstrate the same thing, right? In certain senses, right? There's a minor nuance there, but yeah, I mean, obedience to authority is one of the single most well-studied psychological phenomena in existence, and I would say that the psychological phenomena about which we're speaking right now are some of the most studied phenomena in all of science. I didn't respect this stuff when I was a young man. I thought psychological stuff was usually a little too airy-fairy. The more you look into it, it's like, whoa, there's actually more documentation for some of this stuff than a lot of the things you might see in other fields.
And it's very important. Thank you for pointing that out, because I wasn't clear about that. I was trying to talk about two different things that are on Netflix, but you're absolutely right about the experiments. But the thing about it is that people always think that, it's always interesting to me, and this is particularly true, like in my instance of growing up, right? The way I grew up in a very, very regimented, restricted, authoritarian environment. I see people all the time saying that, like they'll say, like, this is BS. We have to challenge authority. We have to ignore what people are telling us to be true. And then they'll tell their kids, because I said so, you have to do this thing.
Yes.
Right. And so what's happened is that from our very earliest youth, we're being conditioned, particularly in the United States, to respond to authority in a very specific way, that there is a hierarchy, and that hierarchy is not to be challenged or questioned.
Yes.
And if it is, then it requires some conflict, because what happens when you're a small child and you tell your dad, no, I'm not going to do it?
Yeah.
There's some
he's going to come down. Yeah, there will be consequences, depending on what his fathering style is. But yeah,
right. Yeah, I mean, it could be as simple as sitting them down and saying that's not how we act, or it could be corporal punishment, right? I mean, so there's this whole thing that happens, but we're conditioning people from a very early age, and when people respond to that conditioning in their adulthood, it's no surprise.
Yes. This actually brings up, there are a couple, man, you and I could go down so many rabbit holes. This conversation could literally go for like 24 hours without a break.
Probably.
And we would just be warming up. But I want to bring up two interesting things here. So I in a moment, I want to ask you about specific ways that people can recognize when persuasion is afoot in journalism or what have you, in any form, right? When we're all being brainwashed, how can we know that that's happening? And I would like to point out a larger, I want to take what Dave just said about obedience to authority and then, kick this up to another level, take it to a meta level. So I want to reference two different grand theories of persuasion, and they're both very similar. It's almost the same theory. You probably know where I'm going with this, right? One is the heuristic systemic model, and the other one is the elaboration likelihood model. And not to go too deep into those, because it could be a very nuanced, subtle conversation. But the basic idea here is that, as we spoke earlier, there's too much information in the world. We have to find ways to still make decisions and act in this unfathomably complex sea of information. How do we do that? So we use heuristics, we use shortcuts.
Right.
And one of those heuristics is authority. So we say, well, the authorities, they must know better than us, so we may as well go along with it. All right, so we do. Another one is conformity to group norms. If you're running through a forest and you see a whole bunch of humans running away from something, the opposite direction you're going, you're probably thinking, probably saber-toothed tigers, I'm going to turn the other way and go, right? So this is how the human brain, some would argue, and this is sort of the basis of the basic premise of those two different grand theories of persuasion, is that we are hardwired to respond to certain heuristics and that we must use them as a matter of survival. Do you like those two models?
I like them very much. I think they're two of several models that you could use to look at persuasion and say, is this a lens through which we could say we can adequately apply these principles and achieve an outcome? Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know of a better, to me, the heuristic systemic one, probably in terms of practical usage, self-defense, and then also the offensive use, because we all have to get good at persuading other people too. A lot of people don't think that's dirty, but it's not. It's a survival skill, right? It's eminently learnable and usable.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you pointed out, absolutely required. I mean, it's because short of being able to persuade people, we really only have one or two tools left. If we don't have the ability to cause people to change through better words, through better example actions, through better decision making, then we're left with physical force. Quite often, we're left with other forms of coercion that cause people to change because of fear and all the things that come with that. And so,
absolutely. So I want to dive into the other topic that I alluded to, I foreshadowed earlier, and I think this is one that will be extremely useful for everyone. How can we recognize when persuasion is afoot? And a follow-up question would be, how can we recognize when ill-intentioned persuasion is afoot?
I think one of the first big ones, which is been shouted from the rooftops for a long time, is follow the money. So it's, who benefits, who financially benefits from this, who emotionally benefits from this, who gets some sort of gain by presenting this message. And the question, by the way, that's not always bad at all, right? It's fine as long as you understand what's happening. So if I'm trying to sell you something and you understand I'm trying to sell you something for profit to make money, we both agree that that's a good system and that's okay, then great. Then you understand the rules of the game. However, it's when subterfuge is used to conceal the idea that someone is benefiting financially or otherwise from this interaction that it begins to fall apart. So one of the first things you have to do is you have to follow the money. One of the second things you have to ask is, why are people making the argument this way? Why are they using the words or the argument that they're using?
Right.
Listen to the words that people say, right? It would have been very easy when Mark rightly pointed out that I tied two experiments together. I could have easily said, to make myself look better, of course, Mark, that was a trick. I was seeing if you knew the difference, and what I was really trying to say is something completely different, right? So it's very easy to spin these things around, right? And try and make yourself look better or whatever. And that's oftentimes what happens in persuasion. They're trying to hide some subtle affront that happened to them, or some pain or fear or whatever it is that they're feeling or experiencing in that moment. So you have to ask yourself, why are they making the argument the way they're making it? Why are they saying that this thing is true? And then the third thing you have to ask, is there empirical evidence that outside of the argument that's being made in the media that it's being made in, that demonstrates that this is true? And of course, on the far fringes of everything, there's always, well, they don't want you to know. They're hiding this stuff from you. Sometimes that could be true. But quite often what it is that it is unsubstantiated information without good sources that doesn't really necessarily support the narrative that they would like it to, or that they're trying to purport as well. So if people are disaffected on either side. So when you look at, so let's talk about Eric Hoffer for a second. So Eric Hoffer, author of The True Believer, which is a book everybody here should read. And when you talk about that, one of the first steps in creating disenfranchised true believers or enfranchised true believers is a desire for change. So when people have a desire for change, they're discontented people who place control outside themselves quite often, and especially when you're talking about conspiracy theorists and people who are, legitimate conspiracy theorists, not people who are arguing, right? But like people, I'm not, I'm trying to pick something that's that's so far out there that people would probably all generally agree, like, okay, yeah, I get it. Okay, so like drinking your urine, maybe that's a thing that's good. I don't know, but but like most people would say, I'm probably not going to do that. I
know a dude who's an advocate of that, by the way. I know two people.
I know a bunch of people who are advocates of it. But it's like when you're looking at things, I'm like, okay, I don't know that there's empirical scientific evidence that supports it. And perhaps it hasn't been studied yet. And and at some point somebody will, and maybe there is. But currently, to my knowledge, there's not good scientific evidence to support urine drinking. So so that's that there's a desire for change. I want to change my health. I want to do something different. I've tried all of the traditional medical things that I think would help me change my health. I'm discontented. I can't control this thing myself. And there's no hope for change for me as an individual. But I do believe that this urine drinking thing has some merit. It hasn't worked for me, but it sounds so right. So I'm going to go out and purport it as being true, as being, evidential of potential change that could happen. And so that's how that initial sort of movement grows. And it's that simple thing. And so when you're looking at the media, again, you have to ask that question. Is anyone disenfranchised in this process? Is anybody purporting information that can't be verified other places? Are they relying on sources that nobody can prove?
Yes.
And if they are, then you have to strongly question it.
Those are very good measures, I would say. And I want to take this to an even more surface level, so that folks who haven't studied these things can at least get an entry point to start identifying some of these things. So we've talked about a few of the telltale signs, and I think as you were speaking, I was thinking, how do we distinguish this? And I think a way to talk about this that I think might be useful is, how do we recognize when disingenuous conversation is occurring? And so what do I mean by that? You know, what I would like to believe that Dave and I are having, you know, a well-intentioned conversation right now. We're going to listen to each other. We both certainly have things to say. And if Dave says something that I disagree with, I'm going to listen to it, and we're going to, and notice how Dave, like when I brought up that other thing, Dave was instantly like, oh yeah, you know what, actually right. And there was no problem with that, right? There was no conflict. His ego wasn't engaged, right? We were both sort of like, yeah, oh shit, that's right. And if he caught me on something, I would be, oh damn. And I knew, I'd hope that I would have the ego strength and the integrity to be able to say, yeah, you know what, you're right. That's, yeah. You know what, Dave's right. Let's move on, right? So most conversation isn't like that, right? Most conversation is people, you know, hardened in their position. And when challenged on that position, they start to, you know, manifest all sorts of justifications for that position. And now the reason why I think disingenuous conversation is a good starting point is because whether somebody's doing it unconsciously because they are simply, you know, not hardened enough in their ego strength to be able to admit that they're wrong, or they have legitimate offensive, persuasive intentions, like I believe most journalism has today, the manifestation is still the same. And I would like to talk about some of the surface ways that we can identify that's happening. How do we know somebody has gone down that path, whether consciously or unconsciously?
So I think when there's no room for disagreement, when there's no room for questioning, right, to ask better questions, when there's intentional concealment of information, when people are looking at something and saying, it feels like, so one of the places this shows up quite often, let's just use something that most people have some issue with, big pharma, right? And if you dig deep enough in big pharma, you see that they're behind many things, right? They're supporting it either financially or something else. So people will say, well, of course this thing happened because of that. And that's an example of looking and seeing who's supporting this argument financially, who's gaining by it, and who is investing money or time or effort into spreading the argument. I think another thing that you can look at very clearly is over the history of some period of time, like years, is, you know, does it turn out to be more credible and more true, or less credible and more retracted or changed or redacted or whatever the information through the outlet that you're getting it from? And so you can look at it over time and say, has this outlet generally reported the truth, and did the truth turn out to be the truth? So let's just take something that I know is a high, like, I mean, really, you know, like you're touching match to powder keg the minute you say it. But let's just take something like vaccines, for example, right? So everybody are reporting these things every single day. So there's the big pharma crowd that's like, oh, big pharma is trying to make money off of this. They rushed the thing to market. They did whatever. On the other side are people saying, this is insane. We have to protect ourselves at all costs. And so you have to do whatever. Truth of the matter is, right now, there's a whole bunch of people around the world who got vaccinated, and there is not enough time for evidence to be conclusive yet. So you can make all the arguments you want today about whether vaccines are good or bad, and we don't know.
That's right.
We simply don't know, and we're not going to know what the consequences are, the unintended consequences, or anything for probably 5 to 10 years.
But so, Dave, you saying that is putting the world at risk.
It is indeed. It's putting the world at risk of being smart.
Right. Well, notice I wanted to demonstrate something there, and so I did two things that I think are clear tells for, you know, offensive manipulation, right? And one was my tone was very angry, right, and accusatory. And there was an implied ad hominem there, right? And I also accused Dave of something that goes against the group. So I immediately did all in that very short time frame. I did many persuasive things. I accomplished a lot of persuasive goals. I set Dave up in a position where he appeared to be somebody that the group should look at and go, shun him, right?
You shun him, right?
With one
And
sentence.
yeah,
Please.
and if this were an audience of people who weren't, friendly to us, someone
Yes.
would have pointed out by now already, Dave was making a straw man argument. He was
Right.
making an argument that was, he was just covering his bases in every direction by saying, we don't know. He doesn't want to jump off the fence in either direction. He's just fluffing up his argument in a way that, makes him right no matter what. Or, he's not really trying to defend his position. And I'm not trying to defend my position. The only position I really have in this argument is that we don't know. And we're not going to know for 5 or 10 years, because guess what? That we know is true, because that's how science works.
The use of logical fallacies, I would say, is another very strong tell. I don't think that's a straw man argument. I would say it's an unequivocal statement. I mean, we can argue about what can be concluded from the information that we have, but one thing that is not arguable is, I don't think that anybody could say, unless they're claiming to have some kind of psychic power that allows you to look into the future, what the long-term effects of the vaccines are. And whatever your feelings are about the vaccines, if you claim that, some people will say, well, oh, no, we have plenty of information. We have 18 months. Well, we know what happens after 18 months. We don't know what happens after 10 years. And what happens at 18 months is not necessarily a leading indicator of what happens after 10 years, right? Sometimes it takes many years for symptoms.
Mark, I love you, man. You're the best, but they got to you.
See, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Ooh, that's good. Let's deconstruct that. Okay. But they got, okay. Can you please deconstruct what you just did there?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, Mark, man, you're my friend. You're my buddy. I care about you. And I care about you so much that we're still going to be good buddies after this, but you're wrong in ways that you can't even understand. You're not smart enough to see it. I'm smarter than you. And if you were only as smart as me, you would know that what you're saying is wrong. But I'm going to love you. I'm going to care for you. And I'm going to continue to manipulate you and persuade you and try and change your opinion, as long as we can still be friendly and care about each other. Right. So it's that whole idea that, listen, I'm falsely on Mark's side. I'm putting myself on his side. Like, Mark, I really care about you. You're really important to me. And, if that were true, and it is true, by the way, but if that were true, I wouldn't be saying it like that. I would say, Mark, man, I really want to better understand how you got there, because I'm not getting it. Like, I just don't get it, but help me understand. Right. So that's a conversation, not me placating. Mark, I love you. You're the best. You let me educate you. That's more like mansplaining, though. Yeah, let me tell you how it is. But, yeah, well, exactly. But yeah.
So I want to show people how they should respond to that, right? So let's say if Dave were to do that, like, Dave,
Mark, you're the best. I love you, but they got to you, man. You bought this argument. It's unfortunate.
And I would respond to that, something like this. I would say, hey, Dave, I love you too, man. And I would like for you to explain to me, specifically, you said that there are ways that, that you could explain this that I don't yet understand. Can you show me specifically what those ways are? Because I want to understand too. If you have a genuine point, I would like to understand it. And I want to give you the opportunity to articulate that. Right. So now,
so let's go back to my authorities.
Yes. Right. Well, so now you may not have authorities. And if you do, so it does elevate the conversation to the next level. But I've kind of thrown the gauntlet down a little bit. And it's like, hey, show me the justification for it. Now, some people might be like, but come on, it's everywhere, right? Like, I mean, haven't you heard the stories about this? Something I saw last night, which was interesting. I was watching a conversation between Jordan Peterson and a journalist, and the person said, how can you say that there's not enough evidence? Haven't you seen all of the stories, right? Now, what was interesting about that was, do we know that those stories are valid evidence, right? Do we know that they're real? Do we know that they were manufactured by somebody? Do we know that they're indicative of larger phenomena, right? And that's another thing that journalism does, is they'll take an individual story, they will pick it out, and they will present it with the assumption that it's illustrative of larger phenomena.
and then they amplify it with impunity, and it really, it causes people to have real problems. And one of the challenges, so when you yeah, Nick, exactly right, my science is better than yours.
Right.
So when you have this, when you have people having these arguments, right, and
Yeah.
they take this approach, and then you ask something like, okay, help me understand, can you give me some evidence that this is true?
Mm.
One of the things that often happens, and this is important to watch for, particularly in one-on-one interactions or one-on-many interactions, is when somebody doesn't have a well thought through argument, they
Yeah.
won't have that information at hand, right? So now you know that they're repeating information that sounded good to them, that they believed in, but they haven't actually done the work of validating, verifying, and understanding the argument in a way that I could counter Mark's argument and say, well, Mark, listen, I'm going to give you 3 ways that this is right. So let me show you 3 or 4 different examples of medicine that looked promising, in the first 18 months of its use, but turned out to have long-term devastating consequences. And here are these 3 different medicines. And these medicines are similar. I'm not just cherry picking things that are, turned out to be bad, but these are similar kinds of medicines, like vaccines that we abandoned or something like that, right? So then I would give him that information back. And that would cause him at that moment to either be able to say, you know what, I was unaware. I didn't know that was true. He doesn't have to say, I've changed my mind yet either, by the way. He could just say, I didn't know that was true. I want to research that. Can you send me some information so that I can dig into that? And here's why so many people are influenced inappropriately. It's because they're not willing to do what you just did, ask a hard question. And they're also not willing on the other side of that to do the hard work of actually researching and thinking,
Yes.
because it does take a lot of work. And with the massive amount of information, conflicting information, overwhelmingly bad information in many cases coming at us by truckfuls on a hourly second basis now, people don't know where to start to unravel,
Mm.
and they don't know what to really look at. And let's be really honest, most people can't read science anymore. Like, they don't know how to do the deep, heavy work of looking at a scientific research paper and saying, is there a mistake here? Is there a problem? Is there an arguable point inside of this?
And perhaps equally importantly, right? Maybe even more so, I don't know, but we don't have the time.
Oh, time for sure. Which
Time
comes
is
back to your initial thesis about heuristics, right?
heuristics. Yeah.
So we come back to this idea that we have little time, so we have to constantly make decisions about who do we trust, what information do we trust, what filters do we use to decide if they're true or not.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a good set of heuristics that you've refined over time, and
Yes.
even then sometimes you may be fooled,
Yeah.
then you're going to fall prey almost always to something that moves you emotionally.
Yes. Yes. Very well
Because see,
said.
my attempt was not to, when I said to Mark, hey Mark, I love you, man. Like, my attempt was not to move him intellectually, it was to move him at a deep physiological, biological, emotional level, to get him to step around the thing that I was trying to say and say, maybe you're right.
Yeah, and well, and that emotional, one of the truisms of marketing is that people make decisions with emotion and justify them with logic, and I would say that's a very, very well affirmed truism. You and I have probably seen that play many, many times. In the various persuasion fields, that we've played in. I'd like to sort of wrap this up with some suggestions for people to go and get some information. And I'll start with one. I would say that one extremely useful thing for people to do, and it won't take a lot of your time, is to go educate yourself on some of the most common logical fallacies, right? Now, by the way, I think that the educational system needs to be reformed in a very serious way. I think that we're making a tremendous mistake by not teaching people epistemology, the study of knowledge, by not teaching them persuasion, not teaching them media studies. I would say without these types of things, and I could go on a bit more, and I also think physical education needs to be ramped up, whole other conversation. But
100%.
without these things, people are ill-equipped to function in a democracy. period. Because democracy will inevitably become what the critics of democracy say, and that's that democracy ultimately ends up being mob rule, and that the mob is going to conform to whichever charismatic figure is most persuasive at moving the mob. Now, so one of the things that we need to understand about logic, so I want to make two different points here before I kick it over to Dave for a couple more, and we might kick back a few suggestions here. If you start to understand logic, you need to be able to distinguish between the soundness of an argument and the validity of an argument. The validity of an argument has to do with whether or not it is logically valid. So, for example, a syllogism is one of the basic, foundational structures of logic, right? All white people have less melanin, than people who hail from Africa. Dave is a white dude, therefore Dave has less melanin, than all people from Africa. Now that is both valid and sound, right? Sound meaning that the propositions are true, valid meaning that the logical structure is valid. Now I'll give you an invalid argument. Okay. All people, all white people have less melanin than folks who hail from Africa. Dave is a white person, therefore Dave is a cat. Right? That's an invalid argument. Now, the initial two propositions were sound, but I came to an invalid proposition. Now, let me give you an example of an unsound argument that's logically valid. All white people are Nazis. Dave is a white person, therefore Dave is a Nazi. Logically valid, unsound proposition. Right. There are some people who would argue with the soundness of that proposition in today's day and age. No, all white people are Nazis. However, I would say it's a provably untrue proposition.
100%
now,
provably untrue.
People need to know this, and they need to be able to understand fallacies in logic. And you could just type in logical fallacies. There's a website called fallacyfiles.org, I think, is one that does a wonderful job explaining these. They're very easy to learn. Go study one or two a day and start to look for them in your day-to-day conversation, and you will see that they occur far more frequently than most are aware, and that they are used very, very excessively by people who are trying to persuade us in unhealthy ways.
Absolutely. I think that's so true. And those examples you gave are spot on, Mark. They're exceptional.
Thank you.
Another thing, and I'm going to, instead of going down the path that you went down, I'm going to go down a slightly different path to encourage people to look at. So there's a couple of things. Number one, there's a person named Dr. Eric Knowles, who is he was a professor of persuasion influence at the University of Arkansas for many years, and he wrote a book called Resistance to Persuasion. And his book Resistance to Persuasion is phenomenal. And if you can get a hold of his omega strategies, I believe it's called, those are phenomenal, because what he does is he takes all of the ways that people resist persuasion. He breaks them down and shows how do you overcome the resistance. But what he really does is talk about that resistance first and say, here are the ways that people actively resist persuasion. Because you should also, in today's environment, for sure, you should study exactly how you're persuaded and understand how to resist persuasion in a meaningful way. Not for the purpose of just resisting people changing your mind, because you should always have a flexible mind, in the sense that in the face of better data, you should change your mind. And so resistance to persuasion is good, though, when people are trying to make these invalid assumptions or invalid arguments that don't work. And the second thing that I would say is study debate. Like, really understand debate and understand how people argue. And once you understand the structure of arguing, right? once you understand the way that information is presented, the way it's countered, and the way that people are able to take that information in, you become so much more effective and efficient at not only presenting your own information, but also taking in and processing and creating, creating really good heuristics for yourself that allow you to parse information in a way that becomes useful and meaningful.
Mm.
And I want to highlight what Mark said about logical fallacies. If you do nothing but just, I've got a poster of logical fallacies in my office, and
Yeah.
it's, I mean, it's only a small fraction of the logical fallacies that exist. But if you take a look at that, it's really important. And then sort of a final thing is really start to take a look at the neuroscience of persuasion.
Mm.
Why are you so
Yes.
easily moved? Because what we found is I can move you with my words, but if I can move you at a very deep biological level, if I can cause a cascade of chemicals to go off inside your body, I've already persuaded you without even presenting an argument. So if I can just present something in a way that causes that to happen, you're already primed in a way biochemically that allows the very next thing that comes along to slide right in and make it happen. So all of my research on persuasion now has moved from the more mechanical persuasion, which is what we see in copywriting and marketing and all of that,
Yeah.
to looking at how do I implement these ideas of biological, neurological persuasion in people through the tools that we already know work. And then
Yeah.
how can we leverage that in a meaningful way?
Yeah. Wow. That, man. And that's a whole other conversation. We could do another 24-hour conversation just about that.
Yeah.
And that is it's a profoundly interesting field, because a lot of people are not aware that persuasion does go, far beyond just what you're calling the mechanical level. There is a neurological level as well. So for example, one of the interesting phenomena is this notion of mirror neurons, right? Where, well, it does explain some of the mechanical phenomena, like, conformity to emotion, right? But, if you can actually show somebody, for example, or get them to visualize in their mind a particular behavior, they're more likely to perform that behavior. And this was the foundation of what Maxwell Maltz was doing when he used his theater of the mind technique, which is very powerful self-improvement, technology. But if you can get somebody to, so for example, on, a sales page or a sales process, Gary Halbert told me once, that he had, one of the things that he did to boost response was he would tell people, hey, when you call this number, you're about to hear a recorded message, and at the end of it, I want you to leave this information. And that apparently boosted response by about a factor of 3, because what happens is it primes people's minds, as you were saying, for what is to happen next. They see themselves doing this. When you tell somebody, hey, when you do this, you're going to experience this, the mind already goes there in advance, and it sort of greases the wheels to make that behavior occur more naturally. That is a very interesting phenomenon.
Absolutely. And just think about it in simple terms. Like if you fill out a form online and
Yeah.
there's a little thing that says success, your anxiety goes down, that it was
Yes.
complete, something happened, right? And so now the
Yes.
next thing that comes along, you feel good because this thing just happened. All of your pleasure centers have been activated because you were successful. And so now this next thing that comes right after it is also very likely that you'll do because that was fun and successful and it worked. And how many examples do you already have of times that it didn't work and it's frustrating and all of these things? This place is perfect. They've already moved you very, very far down the path that way of
Right.
feeling like what happens next is important. So here's another here. So here, this can I leave people with a little thought experiment
I would love
and
that.
talking about unintended consequences, right? So one of the things I think about a lot. So we're going to pick on Facebook because they're everybody's darling to pick on these days. But Facebook looked at addicts as a means of understanding how to make their platform, and not just Facebook. A lot of social media took this research and shared it around, but they looked at addicts and said, how do people become addicted?
Yeah.
And in what ways might we simulate some of these behaviors in order to get people to become addicted to our technology, right? And they were successful. So if we look at things like the level of anxiety people have now and all of these things, right, which are things that also are very predicted by people who are addicted to substances, they have many similar kinds of behavior patterns and experiences internally that people have who are if you look at the number of children today, for example, who experience extreme anxiety and depression and all of these things, who especially the digital natives born with a phone in their hand, my daughter who's 17 years old, you look at those and they have these experiences of being very overwhelmed by the world around them because they're hit with this deluge of information and technology, and they've just never known a time when they weren't constantly communicated to. So if that's true, if we've taken this addictive patterns and we built it into the technology that we use on a daily basis, what are the unintended outcomes of that? So are we building a society of addicts who can easily become addicted to food, easily become addicted to opioids, easily become addicted to whatever your substance or source of resolve not resolve, but resolution for that sense of urgency, that sense of necessity to do something, to feel something, to have that dopamine, serotonin reaction that causes people to say, I'm satisfied for a second. I feel good. I have that sense of euphoria now. And so we're creating, and I'm not going to say that I know this factually because I don't know it factually, and certainly I'm not doing the research at the level that it needs to be done. But my sense of it is that we may be creating a generation or generations of addicts just waiting for a thing to be presented to them that
it's a very good hypothesis. Yeah.
So but it's all because people were persuaded early on.
Yes.
It's all because they didn't have these good filters. I was on a school board, and one of the people, we had some speakers in, and it was the number 2 person at Khan Academy. It was one of the co-founders of Khan Academy, a co-founder or board member of Khan Academy. I don't remember now, to be honest. But he was saying, here's the interesting thing. Kids don't need to learn long form math anymore. That's probably the worst thing you can teach them, because there's no need for it as a rote memory device, right? From an educational standpoint. He said, you can make a different argument about whether or not learning these things and having to, write them down and learn them and learn the processes may change your brain in other ways. And it may be valuable for that reason, but it really makes no sense for somebody to understand 50 trigonometry equations because they're all available in your pocket. Yeah. And so you don't need to know this. So the most important thing we can teach people is how to interact with the largest piece of AI on earth today, which is a phone in your pocket. And so that's the most important thing we can teach children, not all of these other things. The problem with it is, and this was my argument to him then, is that, okay, great, if we're going to do that, and let's just say that I agree with your thesis, that you're right, like everybody has to interact with a phone, and there's so much information there, and you can do things so quickly, and you can solve all kinds of problems fast. At what point do you give them the tools to know the difference from truth and BS? And he said, well, that's a really good question, but that's not something we're interested in solving in this format.
That's right. Well, it's all about the presuppositions of what their intentions are, right? I mean, if your intention is, I assume that the world is always going to have these devices, whole other conversation. And that the collective good means we will interact better with these devices. Well, then his hypothesis is pretty well substantiated, right?
Yeah.
However, what is the larger good? I think that's probably a more fundamentally important question we might want to ask. What is a healthy human being, right? Does a healthy human being necessarily have to interact with this crap every day?
And 15 years from now, what is the unintended consequences of having done that?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, how does it fundamentally evolve us in ways that we couldn't have anticipated 25 years ago?
I would like to leave everybody with one final tool that they can use, which if you look at persuasion as a sword and a shield, which is a metaphor which I'm very fond because it can be used as both. I want to give you probably the biggest shield I know to protect yourself. And it's something that I call utilitarian model flexibility. So this is in one of my print books. And another way of talking about it is useful lenses. So the idea is this, right? So if the universe is infinite, right, and we don't have any evidence to show that it's not at this point, and it seems that no matter how deep we look, no matter how far out we peer, there are layers upon layers upon layers of things that we keep discovering, right? we certainly can't understand the universe. That we don't have the universe is larger than our ability to understand it, right? So therefore, it's probably impossible for us to know for sure what the capital T truth of anything is, right? Because even observing things, we know, because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and things like that, the observation itself changes that which is observed. So we don't know actually what we're looking at, and we can't distinguish between what's out there and the representations of what's out there that we construct in our mind with our wetware, So if knowing something is impossible, and that's it's a philosophical discussion to be had, but let's assume, that if it's impossible, then maybe instead of looking for capital T truth all the time and holding on to that capital T truth for dear life and defending it as if your ego is attached to it, what we need to do is we need to say, hey, this is the hypothesis that I'm fond of right now based on the information that I have available, completely open to having it be changed at any time, right? So we need, if we are flexible about the model of the universe that we hold at any given time for a particular utility, we can take these models on and off the way we would a lens. So, you and I probably have you both used night vision goggles at different points in the military. At nighttime, great lens, right? Great lens to use. 12 noon, I'm fighting the enemy at 12 noon, probably not the best lens, right? I might need something else. So, if we understand that these different lenses don't have to be necessarily capital T true, but that we can, put them on and take them off at will as needed, I think that it gives you a much healthier orientation to the world because it prevents you from getting attached to these ideas. And if we're going to get a little spiritual, I mean, the whatever you think of Buddhism, one of the really useful ideas from Buddhism is this notion that human suffering comes from attachment, right? Whether you think that's true or not, it's very useful to look at the world in that way because we can clearly see that a lot of human suffering does come from attachment. And the interaction that we have with people leads to suffering often when we are attached to ideas. Dave, anything you'd like to add to that before we wrap it up?
I think that was beautiful, Mark.
Thank you. Dave, how can people find you these days? Because I would love for everyone to go out and find you because, man, you have got such a great skill set that people need to learn from.
Thanks. I appreciate that. You can find me at boldapproach.com, BOLDAPPROACH.com. And you can always send me an email. It's just dave@boldapproach.com. And I respond to emails that I actually see. If they go to spam or something like that, I'll apologize in advance. But I respond to emails and happy to chat with anybody.
Everybody, please do go to boldapproach.com. I have known Dave for probably about 20, maybe over 20 years now.
Yeah.
I can't remember when we first met. We shared the same publisher for a while. Our editor is gone now to another organization.
To another organization, yeah.
Yeah.
And living in Nashville.
And so you're keeping up. Yeah, great guy, by the way. We're talking about Matt Holt, a really awesome dude in the
Wonderful
book
guy.
publishing industry. Wonderful guy, great friend. Dave is a consummate pro with persuasion. And in fact, Dave and I are going to have a conversation now, right after we end this, about another topic, because Dave is going to be guiding me on some of the badass marketing that he has been doing. And we're going to have a secret squirrel private conversation about that, which I'm super stoked about. So I will allow you guys to feel your FOMO and your jealousy, but to assuage that FOMO, go to boldapproach.com and get on Dave's email list and send Dave an email. Hire this dude, because one of the commenters on here, Nick Thackerlaw, the guy from Leads Hook, was telling me that, Dave is behind some of the most successful campaigns that Nick has seen on his platform, which, by the way, is a great platform, Leads Hook.
Absolutely.
Nick gets to interact with a lot of really, really high power campaigns. That comment from Nick is one of the best compliments you can get in the marketing world. So guys, go to boldapproach.com and partake of everything that Dave is doing. Dave, thank you so much, man. Great to talk to you as always.
Thanks, Matt. Sorry. Thanks, Mark. It's wonderful to be here, Matt. Sorry, I was thinking about Matt.
I'll tell Matt
that
you call me Mark.
conversation. Yeah, exactly. No,
We
thanks,
gotta
Mark.
go
I
hang
really
out with Matt.
appreciate it. It's been so long since we've had one of these conversations, and I'd love to do it again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. Likewise. Well, we'll make a point of that. That'll be a future Mark Joyner episode. I just called myself Mike Joyner. A future Mark Joyner episode. You see what you did? There's some psychological.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've screwed this whole thing up now. We don't know who we are anymore.
That's right. That's right. Here we go. To remember, everybody, that's who we are. All right. Everybody have a great, beautiful day or night wherever you are.